Welcome to the Servant Leaders Mindset channel, where we are transforming lives through servant leaders. Up next.
My life experience was such where I grew accustomed to change. My first ship was an aircraft carrier. It was all males, period. My second ship, another aircraft carrier, all male.
Hey everyone, welcome to the show. Today, I have the distinguished honor of chatting with Raymond D. Kemp Sr. Raymond is a highly accomplished servant leader who was recently appointed by President Biden to the American Battle Monuments Commission. He is currently the CEO of Kemp Solutions, an executive training and leadership development company. He served in the U.S. Navy for 33 years, working his way up through the leadership ranks to become a Navy Fleet Master Chief. Raymond is a certified John Maxwell speaker and coach and certified Y Institute coach, WHY. With unwavering integrity, he maintained the highest level of confidentiality, managed multi-billion-dollar budgets and equipment, all while pioneering comprehensive leadership standards covering both personal and professional excellence. His awards include the Legion of Merit, 2 Meritorious Servants Medals, and Combat Action Ribbon. I can go on about his achievements, but I'll stop here and welcome him to the show. Welcome, Raymond.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here with you.
So first, I wanted to start by asking you, why the military? Why did you decide to go into the military?
Well, so I'm born in the 60s, raised in the 70s. And in the 70s, where I'm from in Oklahoma, there was a lot of energy being put towards stress and the impact of stress and high blood pressure and those types of things. And I had 6 aunts and a couple of uncles, and they would get up in the mornings and they'd go on off to work, and some would celebrate what they did and others might complain about it. And I had an uncle who, during the summertime, I would stay over at his house, and me and my cousins would play and do kid stuff, and he'd be there with us. I mean, my aunts would get up and they'd take off and go to work, and he'd be right there with us. Go outside and pick up them twigs from underneath that tree and bring in some baby carrots from the garden. I'm like, that's the job I want. I don't want stress. And found out that he had served in the Marine Corps. He was a Mumford Point Marine, and then served in the Air Force and retired. And I was like, that's the way. And the way things worked out through my high school career, I played sports, but then I also had the opportunity to get visited by the recruiters and the Navy. I'm from Oklahoma again, so a landlocked state, but the Navy recruiter was legit, and he offered me the opportunity to leave about 3 weeks after graduating from high school at the age of 17, and that was an easy yes.
Wow, well, that's interesting. So you're the first Black or African-American Navy Fleet Master Chief. What was it like? And you probably had some leadership positions before you arrived there, but what was it like to integrate the leadership ranks of the Navy?
Well, it was really tricky. So I was the first Black Fleet Master Chief of Navy Europe, Navy Africa, which is about 60,000 people or so, continent of Africa, continent of Europe, and the bodies of water around there. And just to quickly explain what a Fleet Master Chief is, or really a Command Master Chief, and then on to become a Fleet Master Chief, it would be like taking, 3 positions: the CTO, so the Chief Technical Officer, the COO, Chief Operating Officer, and the Chief Human Resource Officer, and merging them into one person. That's the role responsibility of a Fleet Master Chief. So that means I'm tactically proficient when it comes down to all things kinetic. And I'm also administratively sound and apt to teach when it comes to impacting, sailors and what it is that they do. The Navy was one of the last services to integrate. In fact, I remember when I first joined, I was one of the very first, one of the first and few Blacks that were in the data processing rating, is what we call the job specifications For your listeners that might be familiar with the Army or the Marine Corps, they call it MOS. The Navy calls it a rating. And it was really tough. And, there's a word in the English language that is so offensive and polarizing that we don't even use the word anymore. We just use the letter that the word starts with. And again, where I'm from, that language, again, the 70s in Oklahoma and Texas, it's not hard to imagine what that was like with regard to discrimination, the echoes of the civil rights movement, and those types of things. And those very same people, I joined in 1986. You think about 20 years before that, that was 19. So the senior leaders who were my supervisors when I joined the Navy were adults in that civil rights effort. Many of them resistant to blacks even entering into the Navy, much less entering into highly technical skills like data processing or information systems technology, which is what we call it now. And so it was not without challenge. It was not without a high level of resistance. But, I learned at a young age, persistence over resistance creates an environment for growth and unlimited possibility. And that's how it worked out for me.
Interesting, very interesting. So let's pivot a little bit and talk a little bit about your book, because I think it's an excellent example of what leaders should do when they're navigating change. First of all, I think we can all agree that COVID changed everything, just like 9/11 changed everything. And you allude to that a little bit about in your book about what 9/11, how that change had an impact on us. So your book is titled Building Resilience for Hybrid Success Anchored in Adaptability. So your book talks about how your military experience applies to leadership in navigating change. So how did your 33 years in the Navy equip you to navigate uncertain environments?
Sure, absolutely. The thing about the Navy, and we often would call it a tribe of tribes, we would call it a microcosm of society. And I think both of those descriptors are true. Being in a combat environment you don't just miracle your way into the combat zone. You train with a high level of repetition. So you train, you retrain, then you train some more to a high level of repetition to where when you get into the combat environment, it's not a matter of thinking, it's a matter of responding. And so what being in that environment, so I had 11 combat deployments. I served on sea duty, which means I was stationed aboard a ship that would come and go frequently for 19 years total. And so when it comes to crises, when it comes down to the things that might be unexpected, when it comes down to preparing the sailors in particular, hearts and minds, to respond to the unknown, whether it be a missile strike or whether it be someone attacking the pier, where we're stationed, where we were moored or tied up. Those preparing folks for that was just part of our daily routine. In the Navy, we say the routine things should happen routinely. So it was just what we did. There weren't a lot of surprises, even if there's inbound missiles, like on board USS Mason in the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, there were incoming missiles. Well, we know what to do. It's not a matter of chaos overcoming us. When COVID had that, the global pandemic had that impact on us, from my perspective, I thought, what a great time to be a leader, to help people make their way through the unexpected. To encourage them to continue to be innovative, to continue to loyalty, all mixed in there. And that was the reason, that I put the book together. And I believe that the combat experience, the time in the Navy, has equipped me in a way different than most to be able to speak from a position of practical experience in building resilience.
Yeah, you use that in how training, it's almost like athletes who train muscle memory. It's like you don't wait until you get into that situation to start figuring out, well, what do I do now? But you have, and it's what's interesting about COVID and what you say in your book about COVID is that some organizations were, at least the organization that I work for, was pretty much prepared for it because they had already put in the infrastructure, the technological infrastructure, so that people could work remotely very easily. That transition was pretty easy. On the other hand, I think some organizations were caught flat-footed. Many faith-based organizations, particularly churches,
Sure.
they had, well, how do we stream? What are we going to do? Kind of thing, because people could not no longer come on site. And
Right.
then, of course, we'll talk about this a little bit more as we get into the interview, but safety became an issue, a huge issue, particularly at that particular point in time. I was working for a mental health residential facility. So, residential facilities were really pressed about safety from the state standards, but also regulations, but also from just being fearful about outbreaks happening, and not really understanding what this virus really meant and how it was transmitted, etc.
There were so many unknowns that it challenged a lot of people. And I would say that those folks who have, really solid, CFO or accounting team that says, hey, we need to, spread these resources across all of those things that are important to the organization, to your point, including technology. And so those organizations that didn't have streaming capabilities or had outdated computer networking systems were at an extreme, regrettable to have that infrastructure in place. And I was just talking to a one of my clients or potential client yesterday about their webpage and how out of date it was. And he was saying, well, we've got to spend the money on these things. And I thought to myself, I didn't say it at the time, but I thought to myself, you could find yourself in a situation where you need to rely on your webpage. And so if you don't have, the latest and greatest technology, you may find a situation as we did 4 years ago, 3.5 years ago, where you may not be able to, talk to, your client base. And so it's so important that we're conscious of doing that and that we're hiring the right people, and that hiring process oftentimes can include, let me just check your resilience. Let me just see, how, steadfast and how technically proficient you are, of course, yes. But also, to help me with some understanding of how you've been able to endure change and endure challenges. And so, all those things are very important these days in business.
Yeah. Also, in your book, I like what you said. In chapter 4, you said you used the analogy of the ship's hull, and it's being that it was designed to keep the ship buoyant. And you suggest that the ability of an organization to stay afloat depends upon how they embody their core values.
Absolutely.
Can you explain that?
Yeah. When we have, and let's just say the core values are honor, courage, and commitment. It's so important not just to write it out and put it on the wall someplace, throw it on a t-shirt, ball caps, and coffee cups. It's important to live that out. And so when we state them very clearly, we live out those core values. I should, as a CEO or as a leader, I should be the example of what right looks like. And so I live out those core values, and then I celebrate the people within the organization who are adhering to and also living by those core values. That is what creates that measure of loyalty. It creates that buoyancy that I refer to, because when you lay the keel, the keel is that one strong beam at the base of the hull. And that is where I would say the core values lie. And then we build out, again, the keel of the ship, we build that out with all the other things that we prioritize as important for the organization and for the people. And that is how we're able to endure those storms.
Yeah, one organization that I worked for that I thought what they did in terms of embodying core values was to, and you talk about this a little bit in your book, about making sure that people receive recognition for modeling the culture that you're trying to enforced in the workplace. And so it's really important too that when somebody models it, that you say, okay, this is what integrity looks like. This is what this specific honesty looks like. This is what all these things look like in action.
Right. And, when we think about culture, from my perspective, culture is a top down event, and climate is a bottom up event. And so there again, there's core values that are listed someplace, maybe the bedrock principles of the organization. One of my clients has, and those are great. And you can model that. Okay, that's great as well. What's really also important is that the climate. We're very intentional about what that climate is like, and I would describe the climate being bottom up. I would describe the climate as that feeling, when we pull into that parking spot for those who drive, or when we approach the building, or the organization where we work, or even if we sit down and click to log on to our computers, that feeling that we get with our first interaction, our anticipation of the first interaction, whether it be with the client or whether it be with a frontline leader or a peer. What is that? What is that feeling like? And when we have leaders who are very intentional about how they show up in the organization, those leaders are thermostats, and they set that climate in such a way to where folks are knowing that they're going to come in and be treated with dignity and respect. They're knowing that the mission, the vision, the guiding principles of the organization are such that they can get behind and believe in. And that is what amplifies what that culture, may be as driven by the organization.
Yeah, it's really interesting. In terms of too hybrid work, trying to how do you build culture when you have so many people and you've got these shifts going back and forth, people aren't in on certain days and not in on other days, and so on,
Right.
trying to reinforce culture in a hybrid setting. Talk about that. You talk a lot about that in your book. How does a leader reinforce culture under that hybrid model?
Sure. So there have been a number of people who have gotten credit for saying that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And I believe that one of the first things that must happen to reinforce, that culture, and especially in the hybrid environment, is to develop a communication battle rhythm or a communication routine with your team. It lets them know, one, it gives you the leader the opportunity to express that level of care, and two, it gives the employee, the team member, the peer an opportunity to communicate and express themselves so that you can truly know how things are going with them, assess, whether it is a technological proficiency or whether it is a challenge that they may be having, an intangible problem that they be having that they're not expressing to you. Having a measure of communication is crucial. Abraham Lincoln said that there's such a thing as leadership by walking around. And though we may not be working in the cubicle city, in some areas, we have even changed the warehouses and other organizations to where there's not as much human interaction as there used to be. What we can still do is create that rhythm of communication, call, or whether it be through phone calls, text messages, emails, all of those mechanisms that we have to communicate. It's very, very important that we set that routine so that we can express that measure of care. And there's a book, it's actually a relationship book, but I would say, I would challenge it. It's probably one of the best leadership books I've ever read. It's called The Five Love Languages. And there are, and I won't go through all five of them, but there are touch points in there that allow us to communicate at the level that people are most able, to hear and be impacted by. And when we know what that communication point is, for example, between you and I for sure, and certainly your listeners, likely know someone who, if you give them a gift, it's a big deal. So whether that be a presentation for recognition of something that they've done, some people literally just are, lifted up when they get words of affirmation, or maybe it's a literal pat on the back or a hearty handshake. Those types of ways to communicate in person are almost easy to figure out. But in the hybrid environment, it's equally as important, but more difficult to discover. And a way to make sure that we're able to do that is by the best means of communication. And I'm getting a little long here, but there are some folks who communicate very well via text, others who need to have a voice text or the video calls and all those mechanisms. Leaders who have a plan to be successful figure out what the best means of communication is, and then they're agile enough to use whichever those languages, even if it's different than their own.
Yeah, I like what you said in your book when you were talking about being inclusive, like particularly when you talked about introverts. Me being an introvert, And even though maybe it doesn't look like it on the surface, I'm an introvert, really. But just making sure that you're communicating with them, or that they have a seat at the table and they have a voice at the table, because their inclination is not to say anything unless they're asked for their advice and so on. Or it could be just to deep reflection, just analyzing the whole situation before you speak. So I like what you said about that, making sure that everybody's voice is being heard.
And being able to set the conditions to where they can communicate outside of that group, and so some people love to click the hand up button on a Zoom call and say pick me, and then there's others that are you have to watch the body language, and so if they're nodding in agreement, or if they are and some other writing notes diligently, okay, well, let me send you a chat note and say, hey, do you have anything you want to add to this? And that gives them the opportunity to either unmute and speak on it, or respond to your chat note. I mean, so those types of things, I think, create space for us to be our best.
Yeah, the other thing I was thinking about as I was reading your book and thinking about COVID itself, that COVID was in and of itself a huge change and had a huge impact on everybody. But also there were other upheavals going on at the same time, like the whole George Floyd thing happened right in the middle of COVID. And so organizations too were scrambling to deal with which emerged as this sort of DEI movement.
Right.
And so it was very interesting, because the organization that I was involved in at the time was like, yeah, how do we implement this? And even though DEI had been around for such a long time, it seems as though it was a whole new thing and people were trying to really figure out how to do it in such a way that people felt heard, and that people felt like that they really wanted to provide equality, more equality in the workplace. So,
Sure.
what are your thoughts on DEI? And now, of course, you talk about a little bit in your bio about you were in the military at the time, where they're like, don't ask, don't tell. And then eventually they came back and pulled that back and repealed it. So, and going back and forth depending on who's in the leadership position, particularly president. But having said that, and now DEI programs are being retracted and nobody
Right.
wants to hear anything about that anymore.
Right. It's
It just so fast, we went from swinging from one side to the other side of the pendulum. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that thankfully my life experience was such where I grew accustomed to change. My first ship was an aircraft carrier. It was all males, period. My second ship, another aircraft carrier, all male at first. We did a combat deployment. We came back. We re-outfitted the ship to allow women to come on board. And the next thing you know, first time ever, now there's women coming on board combatant ships. As you mentioned, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, lots of change. What I learned through experience was when you talk to people, help them understand, explain and help them understand the mission of the organization and where we're heading and how to get there. And then perhaps even create an environment of inclusion. And how do we do this? But this decision has been made. The president decided we're going to do this. How do we, which was really tough, but how do we do this the best way? And very interestingly, people closest to the problem oftentimes have the solution. So the younger people, for example, with women and with the Don't Ask, Don't Tell situation, the younger folks, it was really no big deal to them. It was no big deal, for someone who had never been on a ship that was all male to have, women come on board, because that's what their life had been, whether it be through whatever mechanism of education or vocation that they used before they came into the Navy. The thing that's interesting about our current civil state is that there's not the rule, the golden rule, perhaps I could use that language, that was going on when I grew up. When I grew up, the Bible was the answer. So if the scripture says that we should, treat everybody with dignity and respect, that's my language, but if the scripture says that we should treat everyone with love, and love, covers, a multitude of all those things, then caring for one another should have been was a way to kind of quell some of the differences that were going on. And the environment that we're in right now is very different. The distance that we have come in the last 60 years with regard to civil rights, that's one thing. But we also have the technology, wisdom, and understanding to realize that the gerrymandering that's going on, with regard to voting rights is really not fair and it's not equitable. So I do believe that there are still places and reasons to have someone to keep their eye on the rules and ensure that we're adhering to them. And DEI in some organizations is not a thing because the culture, we talked about that already, right? The culture and the climate support treating everyone with dignity and respect. But then there's other cultures that are not necessarily founded on that and do not necessarily celebrate the diversity of thought or demographic, that we still need to have a measure of policing our behavior. And so to your point, there are states that have gotten rid of a lot of things that seem like they would even the playing field and allow for everyone to participate the same. In those environments, I fully support. But the organizations that are whether it be state and local government, that are taking away me to enter into a certain part of town and stay safe, to enter into a certain workforce and be safe and given the opportunity to be treated in a meritocracy type of environment. The things that are taking that away are frustrating to me. So it's a lot of words right there. I hope that regardless of how we repackage DEI, because DEI was equal to climate consultants to repackage to DEI. And I'm not sure what it's going to shift to nowadays. I mean, they may open up resilience offices within each organization. And if they do that in your organization, give me a call. They will repackage DEI because there are enough people in America who believe in the love that should flow from one to another that we won't get it. We will not allow the rule of law to change to where people can just be treated any kind of way. So DEI needs to stay around.
Yeah, and not only that, I mean, because of the diversity and America's becoming more and more diverse, that we're going to have to work that out because we're almost forced into making those changes. But I believe that it is a process. It's not going to happen overnight, just like it's always continually moving towards whatever the goal is and the direction. But I think it's helpful when people, you mentioned this in your book about looking at the metrics. How do you define equality in the workplace? What is the definition of it in terms of, does it mean that we have a percentage, this percentage of women, this percentage of African Americans, et cetera, and so on?
Right.
So, it's probably going to be different for each organization because some fields are just male dominated,
Right.
police officers, that kind of thing. And so, what does diversity look like, or what does DEI look like for a specific organization? It might be different for each one.
Definitely. Yeah. And there are some fields that, certain ethnic groups are drawn towards and there's some that are not. The thing is that when we're making sure that it's fair and equitable, that red herring can swim upstream and get to where they want, regardless of, where they came from.
Yeah, I think people are okay as long as they see progress. And I think that is the problem. Instead of going backwards,